Again, I'm Celestina. I actually work for an organization called St. James Infirmary. I think I have a bit of an intro in the presentation, so I won't go into too much. But I am a proud mama to a 14-year-old trans son. I am also a queer, femme, dyke, longtime activist in queer community, especially supportive of my trans community. Sometimes I forget that I'm not actually trans. I do identify as xenogender, hence the pronouns she, her, meow. It would delight me if anybody addressed me by meow. I've been with St. James Infirmary for a very long time, since like 2003. And we are an organization of created by and for supporting the sex worker community. And I will tell you a whole lot about more what that means. We also espouse a harm reduction philosophy at St. James Infirmary, and I really feel like harm reduction, the concept of harm reduction, is something I very much feel like is very central to the Oregon Country Fair, even though it's not necessarily named as such. It's a concept that started in drug user community, and I think sometimes there's maybe a little bit of a divide between like weed smokers and people who use other drugs, like weed and psychedelics on the one hand, and then harder drugs on the other, and like not necessarily like compatible community or allied community. But I like to think of it as a matter of bodily autonomy. So I'm not judging people who use anything, and I think we all deserve the God-given right to make decisions, or if you're atheist, nature-given right, or just your own unalienable right to bodily autonomy. We all deserve that, in all across the board, no exceptions. Bodily autonomy. So harm reduction is basically the idea that that you can support somebody right where they are. So, even if somebody, like in the drug user community, you might use that sort of, an example might be somebody who's trying to, they use heroin. In the past, maybe they were, it was a problem for them as they defined it for themselves. They stopped using for a while. Maybe now they use occasionally. And they're coming, like if you're working in like service provision, or if you're just friends or family with somebody in a situation like that, just a matter of saying like, I'm not judging you, you're not a bad person, like I support you and your decisions for living your best life. And so, not turning somebody away because you don't agree with the choices that they're making about what they want to do with their own body. So that being said, I'm really delighted to see, I saw a few places around the fair, Narcan. Are you all familiar with Narcan or naloxone, also known as naloxone? Yeah? Raise your hand if you know about Narcan or naloxone. Yay! Okay, so a lot of people. So, but I see a few people didn't raise their hands. That's cool. So what it is actually it's this wonderful drug that will do nothing for you unless you are having an opioid overdose. So if I were to just take it right now, I have no opioids in my system, it would do nothing for me. If somebody has opioids in their system, it will block the receptors in that person's brain. So they will not be, their brain won't be having the effects of the opioids. And that gives the body a little bit of a chance to process the opioids. Like, instead of it all being on board, their body will start processing it over a longer period of time. So it literally brings a person from literal death back to life. So it's kind of a miracle drug. And like I said, it's not something that'll do anything to you if you don't have any opioids on board. So I have some Narcan with me. I'm gonna set it out right now. This is a nasal one, super easy to use. If you've ever used like a nasal spray, like for allergies or a cold or anything, you just stick it in the nose, spray it. Once you've verified that somebody is non-responsive and you think they might be having an opioid overdose. This is nasal. These ones are injectable. And by the way, they all come with 2 because sometimes you have to give more than 1 dose. So if you know CPR and you can do CPR while you're trying to see if they'll come back, then you can administer CPR. Give it a couple minutes. If they're not coming back, you can do another dose. So they always come with 2 doses. These are injectable if you know how to do an injection. The instructions are on here pretty clear. Hopefully, you can always just say, hey, does anybody know how to do an injection? I've got Narcan right here. So if anybody wants them, if you want to keep it at your camp or you know some place that it would be good to have them, I'm sure they have it over at Whitebird, and I've seen them in various other places around. Now, these are what we call hoe packs. You might not want to go up to somebody and refer to somebody as a hoe if you don't know them and you don't know that they're cool with that. But, like within our community, we lovingly call these the hoe packs. Condoms, lube, wipes, mints, and information. So information about our clinic or any kind of information like community resources that might be helpful to people. We give these out. If anybody needs one, here they are. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. So I'm Celestina Pearl. I'm the Outreach Director at St. James Infirmary in San Francisco. So this presentation I call Caring for and About Sex Workers. I'm going to talk about the history of sex work, or the history of St. James Infirmary, and then a history of sex work and harm reduction. I'm going to talk about different types, different challenges, both systemic and legal, ways to respectfully engage with sex workers, because you just never know. I like to kind of think of it as like anyone could be. So if you're speaking respectfully about the idea of somebody possibly being a sex worker, you can avoid alienating someone who maybe has been in the past or currently is. And they might feel more comfortable about talking to you about their actual real life and things that actually might end up being life-saving for that person. And especially trans, BIPOC, unhoused, and street-based sex workers, because personally, for me and the organization that I work for, we do street-based outreach, and to me, I always feel like the most marginalized of any community needs to be prioritized. Yeah. And then I'm going to talk about some resources, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So the history of St. James Infirmary. Oh, and I also have some cute pictures of us from, we call our mobile van the Naughty Nurse Mobile, and we go out on the streets a couple of times a week from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. Checking in on the strolls. So we check in on the folks who are out there working on the street, make sure they're being treated well. We have a bad date list, so if they've had any encounter, any kind of abusive, exploitative encounter with anyone, they're able to report it to us. They can also go on our website, or there's an app, and we have a paper version. So they can report the bad incident that has happened, and then that way others can be forewarned about it. And just generally like check in. If, folks often are like, can you get us, we like the scented wipes, which I'm like, really? Okay, fine. But like basically all the supplies we give out are because people have specifically asked for it. So whatever the ladies want, that's what we're there for. So St. James Infirmary started, well, actually, let me back up a little bit. So 1993, there was a task force on prostitution that was that came together in San Francisco. And then in 1996, a report came out that determined that the city's responses to prostitution were harmful. In 1998, Margot St. James, RIP. She's our namesake, St. James Infirmary, named after Margot St. James. She passed away a few years ago. And Dr. Jeffrey Klausner, they did outreach to the sex worker community, and they created, with the collaboration of the Department of Public Health, STD Control and Prevention, aka City Clinic. So a lot of the staff from City Clinic, actually, like the medical staff kind of formed the medical staff for St. James Infirmary. As well as University of California, San Francisco, Coyote, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. They were a feminist organization in the 70s. There actually still is a chapter in Rhode Island. They're really rad. If you know anyone in Rhode Island, or if you're curious, you can check out Coyote Rhode Island or Coyote RI. They're very active and they're really cool. They have like a lot of services and resources and a really strong community. And then also the Exotic Dancers Alliance. So originally located in the South of Market neighborhood in San Francisco within City Clinic, St. James Infirmary operated the clinic hours after City Clinic's hours. And that was when I first got involved in 2003. So it was a few years after they had first started. There would be a line all the way down the block. And this was before Obamacare. So there were a lot of people who had no health care. So there was a big need for health care, period. And also health care that was going to be non-judgmental with allied community. In 1990s, Coyote member Priscilla Alexander developed the program plan for St. James Infirmary that was founded on a holistic approach towards healthcare for sex workers as determined by the community. So a very harm reduction approach. St. James Infirmary services include primary care, gynecological and urological care, transgender hormone therapy, HIV, STI, TB, and hepatitis testing, STI treatments, Hep A and B immunizations, a lot of like acupuncture and massage, what we call holistic services, peer and mental health counseling, support groups, food, clothing, safer drug use supplies, safer sex supplies, information and service linkages, as well as apprenticeship and internship programs, and research and education. A lot of universities and students, in fact, last year, even some high school students reached out to me wanting to write a paper about sex workers. And so a lot of people come to us for information about sex workers and sex work. And I've also gotten a lot involved in legislation as well, which I can talk more about that later. So St. James Infirmary has moved several times, and it's expanded services over the years to include the mobile clinic, like I said, AKA the Naughty Nurse Mobile. We also do, we can do medical services and HIV and STI testing and stuff from the van, which is kind of great because, like sometimes we would have like a pimp, like I was like across the board, like, the stereotype, like pimp bad. These people seem to be like pretty cool with each other and like all came together to come and get STI testing before starting their shift. And then they could go off on their shift and be like, hey, I'm negative. So cool. So we're currently over in the South of Market neighborhood, if that means anything to any of y'all. So we have a mission to provide compassionate and non-judgmental healthcare and social services for all sex workers. And I'll get into that more specifically because there's a lot of different areas of sex work. It's a whole industry. And then, of course, like I said, it's special focus on street-based BIPOC and trans sex workers. So overview of sex work itself. Definition: provision of sexual services or performances by one person or more, the sex worker, or workers, for which a second person or group, like sometimes people might do like a bachelor party or, an event of some kind, or like if you ever have been to a strip club, like one performer performing for a group, or, a group of people performing for, you get the idea. And then that secondary person or party providing some form of compensation. So that can be money, but that can also mean housing, drugs, a trade of any kind that holds some kind of value. The term sex worker was coined by American prostitute activist Carol Lee, aka Scarlet Harlot, in the 1970s as a political term. I'm actually wearing Carol Lee, aka Scarlet Harlot's dress that was designed especially for her by Gilbert Baker, who created the very first rainbow pride flag in the late 70s. And very dear friend of mine. She passed away last year. So the law in general, so direct contact sex work, currently illegal in all states except in certain counties of Nevada where it is legalized. Legalized, not decriminalized. I can talk a little more about the difference between legalization and decriminalization, but just put a bookmark right there. I'm like, I see no children in the audience. I think it's okay for me to say this. So basically, if one person, if a body part of one person is entering a body part of the other person, and the person who is being entered receives money for that or some kind of value compensation, that is illegal in the United States. Every state of the United States, except for a couple of counties in Nevada. I know, it's very broad and kind of ridiculous because there's a whole lot that can happen. It's like outside of that very like arbitrary definition, right? But I think that maybe is what the government's definition of sex is, maybe, which is like, wow, y'all have a real exciting sex life, I guess. So, in California, the Penal Code 647B makes it a misdemeanor offense for both providers and clients to engage in, quote, acts of prostitution. Related charges, quote, loitering to commit prostitution, which, yay, SB 357 in the state of California, and just prior to that in New York, that law was repealed, both in New York, I think 2 years ago, and officially as of January of this year in the state of California. So the cops cannot arrest somebody because they think that they look like a prostitute. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and I was part of a group called, oh God, what were we called? Decriminalized Sex Work California. Very instrumental in we fought our off to get that passed, and we did. And also lewd conduct in public and indecent exposure, very common charges, quote, pimping or pandering. Broad definition, working collectively for safety. Which is criminalized as both felony and misdemeanor. So when you generally think of that as being like a pimp-prostitute relationship, not necessarily. Anyone who is like, that could be a roommate, that could be an adult child living with their parent, that could be the boyfriend, girlfriend, partner of somebody who is doing sex work, a group of people who are working together to keep each other safer, to share costs, to support each other in community. So basically there's, the law criminalizes creating community for sex workers. Administrative laws and workplace regulations, such as in massage parlor workers, strip clubs, and theaters. And that's a whole nother ball of wax. There's a lot of exploitation that happens even with legal, quote unquote, sex work. A lot of people say there's a difference between being like an exotic dancer and a sex worker. I generally think of that as being a broad category that just covers any kind of erotic labor. But there is a lot of exploitation within strip clubs. That's a whole nother story, and I'd be glad to talk about it if anybody wants to hear more about that. So the history, so this is 3 pages long, so settle in. And this is, and I mean, you've heard maybe have heard the expression, the oldest profession, or, you know, something along those lines. It's true. Like, as long as there have been human beings on this planet, there are records of sex workers, including like drawings on cave walls, etc. So this is a relatively modern history of sex work right here and just in the United States. So this is just a tiny bit. But this wonderful performer and stand-up comedian named Caitlin Bailey does this one-woman show that's like a really comprehensive history of sex work, starting with those cave wall drawings. So fast forward a little bit. Sex work has a long history in the United States, yet laws regulating the sale of sex are relatively new. In the 18th century, the law did not directly address prostitution, but law enforcement often targeted prostitutes. Laws against lewdness and sodomy were used in an attempt to regulate sex work. Red light districts formed in the 19th century in cities across the US in an attempt by sex workers to find spaces where they could work, isolated from outside society and corresponding stigma. Ambiguity in the law allowed for prostitutes to challenge imprisonment in the courts. Through these cases, prostitutes forced a popular recognition of their profession and defended their rights and property. Despite sex workers' efforts, social reformers looking to abolish prostitution outright began to gain traction in the early 20th century. Now, even to this day, there is a big divide between what people consider like a proper feminist and sex workers, to which I would say if you believe in bodily autonomy, and you're a feminist, then you should really believe in supporting sex workers because we all deserve bodily autonomy, and there should be no exception to that. Thank you. New laws focused on the third-party businesses where prostitution took place, such as saloons and brothels, holding the owners culpable for the activities that happened within their premises. Anybody here ever heard of FOSTA SESTA? Cool, so a few of you are pretty well informed. So FOSTA SESTA is basically the online version of that. An owner of a website can be held federally liable, actual fines and even up to prison time for what they consider like, in a sense, sort of like pimping because they're supporting sex work under the guise of trying to combat human trafficking, which it has not. Human trafficking is only forced more underground. When you take down any kind of forum that helps people stay safer, whether it's consensual or non-consensual. If it's non-consensual, then people can be more easily tracked and supported. And if it's consensual, then people end up being in more compromising situations. So whether you're talking about in a real life dwelling or whether you're talking about online advertising, taking away the spaces of marginalized communities to be able to support each other, is always going to make people less safe, sex workers or not. So red light districts began to close. In 1910, the Mann Act, or White Slave Traffic Act, and the white part is indeed racial, made illegal the act of coercing a person into prostitution or other quote-unquote immoral activity. The first federal law addressing prostitution, at least in the United States. So yeah, like I said, the white part of that is indeed racial. So it was really only like a concern about the purity of young white women. So this act was created to address the trafficking of young European girls who were thought to have been kidnapped and transported to the US to work in brothels, but criminalized those participating in consensual sex work. So for a lot of sex workers who were black, a lot of sex workers who were Chinese immigrants, these laws did not pertain to them. And so rather than the government being concerned with protecting their purity, they were demonized and criminalized for the same thing that young white women were being protected against. Oh, and this one's lovely. At the start of the First World War, a Navy decree forced the closure of sex-related businesses in close proximity to military bases. Restrictions and outright violence led to the loss of the little control sex workers had over their work. In addition to this, in 1918, the Chamberlain-Cahn Act made it so that any woman found to have you heard that right, any woman, didn't say sex worker, any woman found to have a sexually transmitted infection, STI, would be quarantined by the government. The original purpose of this act was to stop the spread of venereal diseases among US soldiers. Under this act, prostitutes, or those perceived to be prostitutes, so in other words, they left the house, could be stopped, inspected, and detained and sent to a quote-unquote rehabilitation facility if they were found to test positive for any venereal disease. So they were kidnapped, in other words. They were kidnapped and incarcerated. The state had made sex workers into legal outcasts. During the Great Depression, black women in New York City accounted for more than 50% of arrests for prostitution. And I'm sure that is actually probably an understatement. I'm sure it's way more than 50. And that statistic actually holds to this very day, by the way. Those statistics we used for SB 357 to repeal the loitering with intent to commit prostitution. We used those same statistics, just randomly, well, somewhat randomly, based in LA. Same exact. Almost, it was like 53%. Types of sex work expanded in the 21st century. Film and later the internet provided new opportunities for sex work. In 1978, Carol Lee, yay, a prostitute and activist, coined the term sex work, as it is now used. She looked to combat the anti-porn movement by coining a term that reflected the labor and economic implications of the work. And other similar groups formed in the 1970s and 80s to push for women's sexual freedom and sex workers' rights. A rift formed, like I said, within feminism that continues today, with some arguing for the abolishment of sex work and others working for acceptance and rights for sex workers. In June 1999, St. James Infirmary was founded as the first clinic run by and for current and former sex workers. In April 2013, the San Francisco District Attorney and SFPD very reluctantly, agreed to the policy to not use condoms as evidence of prostitution any longer. I don't know if any of you knew this, but if you are generally a woman or female presenting person or femme spectrum person, you're out on the street and you have condoms on you, unless you're in San Francisco, the police can arrest you and detain you for having condoms on you as evidence of prostitution. I know, right? So generally you'd think, oh, well, you know, I'm not a prostitute. I don't have to worry about that. No, this applies to anyone. You leave your home. You're out on the street. Yeah. the cops can actually arrest you. And then add on top of that, maybe you're black, maybe you're trans, maybe you happen to be going out dancing and you're dressed in something cute. Yeah, that's why we all need to be supporting each other. Here's where I get to talk about FOSTA SESTA a little bit. Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, SESTA, and allow states and victims to fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, FOSTA, are the U.S. Senate and House bills, respectively, that the FOSTA SESTA package that became law on April 11, 2018. FOSTA SESTA is a federal law that makes it a crime for websites to enable or facilitate sex commerce. And by facilitate, that just means like advertise at all, or even talk about in any way. So maybe not even advertising, but just like, hey, like anybody want to get together and talk about like, you know, being in community and supporting each other? Illegal. This has resulted in advertising platforms for erotic service providers of all kinds being shut down and has forced many of us out of relatively safe online spaces into riskier street work. A number of resources and advocacy organizations have also had to close. I actually started doing, in January of 2018, I started doing the Naughty Nurse Mobile and going out onto the streets, initially like scouting out, basically developing the whole program, and literally the week, maybe by the next week, after FOSTA SESTA passed, the population out there on the street literally tripled. And I'm saying that not just because of my perception, because we keep a log of who we're giving stuff out to, not names but just demographics. So I actually had the like cold hard numbers to say, previously it was about 20 on in this particular area. Now there's like 60. So it's less safe, and yeah. So thank you, FOSTA SESTA. In 2019, California passed SB 233 to improve the health and safety of people in the sex trade by ending the practice of using, quote, condoms as evidence. So when I said previously that was just San Francisco, right? So SB 233, that's for the whole state of California. So the whole state of California, it is not, the cops cannot arrest you and imprison you for having condoms on you. But if you're not in California, I don't know. You might want to look into the law if you're somebody who's going to carry condoms on you. So California has passed SB 233 to improve the health and safety of people in the sex trade by ending the practice of using condoms as evidence of prostitution and giving people power to report a violent crime that they've experienced or witnessed without being arrested or prosecuted for related sex work or misdemeanor drug offenses that may have occurred within that situation. So in other words, if somebody is in a situation, somebody is like, just decides like, I'm not going to pay for these services, and the sex worker gets pissed off, they fight about it, she gets beat up, she has the legal right to report that to a cop or to any agency that person feels comfortable speaking to report that an assault has taken place. And let's just say that, she maybe also happens to smoke crack, or the dude, there was another person present who was that misdemeanor drug offense within that situation kind of goes away, and the person can't be prosecuted for sex work if they need to report a violent crime that they've experienced or that they've witnessed. In 2021, New York passed a repeal of the loitering with intent to commit prostitution law. So yay, I mentioned that. And then in January of 2023 of this year, so Governor Gavin Newsom signed SB 357 into law repealing loitering with intent to commit prostitution in the state of California. Yay, so that kind of brings us up to right now. In the work that I do, we've been battling with the cops and the neighbors like a whole lot because just because a law says that you can do something or can't do something does not necessarily mean that in actual real life that that's how it's going to work. So people still have to fight for their rights, even once laws have been passed in their favor. So you still have to fight for those rights. I mean, it's not legal to lynch someone. Telling you what, it happens. So we have to support each other, and we have to fight for our rights. Okay, I'm going to move on to harm reduction now. So like I was mentioning, the reason that I brought the Narcan and the Hopax, these are all harm reduction measures. So we're not telling people, don't use drugs. We're not telling people, don't have sex. We're just saying, like, if you're going to use drugs and you're going to be around people who are using drugs and you might not know what's in them. You maybe have heard of fentanyl. Have y'all heard about fentanyl? Ugh, deadly. So fentanyl, some people, if a person is taking it and they know that they're taking it, and we give out test kits too, so you can see if there's fentanyl in your drugs, then you can be informed. It's a very heavy-duty painkiller. So a person may choose to take it, but if you don't know that you're taking it, I mean, there have been like kids who are just like, maybe just like, woo, let's get wild, I want to try Molly for the first time. And then there's fentanyl in it and they die right then and there. Narcan could save their life if it's available. So it's a great drug. I just smoke weed. Like, I'm not even like, but I love people who use drugs, and I love that, I'm like Maud from Harold and Maude. Like, I love people. They're my species. I don't want to see people die. So, yeah. So, yes, these are harm reduction strategies. So harm reduction refers to a range of public health policies designed to lessen the negative social or physical consequences associated with various behaviors, both legal and illegal. Harm reduction policies are used to manage recreational drug use and sexual activity in numerous settings. I don't know if I really like the word manage, though, because it's really more about just respecting what other people want for their own bodies and their own life. Manage, I feel like, kind of means like you're telling somebody what to do. Harm reduction isn't about that. It's about supporting people where they're at. This is what you want for your body. Can I support you in that? Hey, if you're opposed to it and, it's totally valid and legit, step away, But also, if you're in the service industry, like, personally, I think it's real messed up that there's people who are like, oh, you're gay? Well, I'm not going to make a cake for you. Oh, you use drugs? Oh, I'm not gonna offer health care to somebody who's a drug user. Like, I feel like that's wrong. And so, I feel like people should just consider their values when they go into some kind of service industry. Like, are you really prepared to support people in the way that you say you're ready to support people, or not? And that shouldn't be like, oh, you're dirty, you're a drug user, you're this, you're that. So no, I feel like that's wrong. Because that's called discrimination. That's not called religious exception. Like, your religion is your religion, and you have every right to that, but then don't say that you provide services of whatever kind. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of sex work. So, we talked about how there's a wide variety of types of sex work. So some categories that people can use would be like indoor, outdoor, or indoor. So, like I said, I feel like it's most important to support the most marginalized of our communities. And that kind of starts with street-based sex workers. Oh, okay, cool. So street-based or internet-based, in cars or on the street, in hotels, brothels, or private residences. So yeah, what the location of somebody doing sex work. And then also a difference between survival and sex trade. So like I was saying, like that can include not only like actual cash money, but a trade of something of value. So trading for like housing, food, substances, and also many people who perform survival sex do not identify as sex workers. So that's why I was kind of saying, like, you don't go up to somebody and say, "Hey, ho," like you can't do that. But if that's how they identify, then like I want to respect where that person is coming from, and not be like, "No, you can't use that word to like define yourself." And then independent collective or management. So that's like, some person may work completely by themselves. Some person might work with a group. Another person might work with management, aka a pimp, or just somebody who's like their safety person, somebody who helps with like advertising, and basically there's a lot of different ways that people can make arrangements with each other. And then there's also fetish, BDSM, so a specialization or particular service offered can include full contact or none. Escort, generally that just means that you are like arm candy for somebody, and that may or may not include an agreement for actual sex. And then out-call, in-call, that refers to like how a person, so I know we talked about like indoor or outdoor, but it could also be like indoor, but at somebody else's place, or in a hotel room, or in somebody's own place, or a place that like a group of people might rent together. And then also, so sex work that does not explicitly involve penetrative contact with the client. And again, this is the government making these decisions about what constitutes sex. So just saying. Sex work that does not explicitly involve penetrative contact with the client is not illegal in the Bay Area, and I think in most places in the United States. So like porn, webcamming, phone sex operators, exotic dancing, stripping, fetish work, BDSM, escorting that does not involve like penetrative sex, and then therapeutic, sexological body work, or sex surrogacy. So all of these things are generally legal in most of the United States, as long as it doesn't involve penetration by the person paying and being penetrated by the person receiving money. Let's see, I'm going to skip this part because we're short on time now. So ways to respectfully engage sex workers. Don't make assumptions. SB 357, the like repealing like loitering with intent to commit prostitution, that is completely about assumptions. Like I'm usually pretty good at like gaydar, but like, sex worker-dar, like, because that's what I do like several nights a week. And plus, like, I know a lot of the folks out there too. But I like, maybe once a night, even twice a night, I'm wrong. And it's very subtle. I'll be like, oh, her purse is too big. She's waiting for an Uber. So, but anyway, but just in general life, like don't make assumptions because, you just never know. I mean, I feel like that just really applies to a lot of things, like don't make a racist joke because you think that a person is not POC or that they're, or their child or their partner or whatever, like you think that that's okay. So don't make bigoted comments about sex workers. Sex workers are just people who have a certain job, because you just never know. I mean, that person might be a sex worker or someone they love is a sex worker. Several years ago, we had a photo campaign in San Francisco called "Someone You Love is a Sex Worker," and it's true. Like, there's such a stigma around it that a lot of times people may not be out about it. So don't make assumptions. It really will open things up a lot that could end up saving somebody's life because they feel safe enough to talk to you. Respect boundaries and privacy. Like I said, many sex workers are not out. So it's not cool. Don't out somebody about anything that you don't know is okay to talk about that person's life. And so especially something as stigmatized as sex work. So that's for that person to tell their story, not for you to tell their story, right? Address your prejudices. We all have them. I do. And I've, for many years, have, been working in sex worker community and advocacy. Like I surprised myself when I was like, oh, like there's this stereotype about what a pimp is. And it's like, really, that's just somebody who's supporting a sex worker. And it could look so many different ways that people can mutually agree upon. Utilize a harm reduction and trauma-informed approach. I feel like we talked enough about that like, you just respect where people are at and support people in the ways that they say that they want to be supported and respected. Promote feelings of dignity and empowerment. So it's not about pitying somebody like, oh, your life must be so horrible. Don't assume that. You want to treat all people with a sense of dignity and empowerment. Like, yeah, honestly, like sex workers are very empowered people that are rad. So, and there's a huge variety of people's life situations, right? And acknowledge the huge amount of diversity in the sex trade. So, just because somebody is a sex worker, you don't know their story. It could be so many different things. Respect the rights of all people to make decisions about their bodies. Watch your language and the language being used by others around you about sex workers. And don't project personal feelings of pity, fascination, or disgust. Remember that sex work is work. My sister-in-law just earlier asked me, like, well, are you going to be talking about, like, bad sex work or good sex work? And I said, neutral. That's the goal. Sex work is work. Like for some people it can be exhausting. They're sick of it. They're done with it. For some people they're like, woo, I love it. I do burlesque. Whatever, like, yay. And, and for some people they're just like, nah, that's okay. I'm good at it. I make good money. It's neutral. Do your own research, like just like a lot of things, like you can ask people questions, but don't just rely solely on like, oh, you're my research subject. Like, no, pay people if you want to ask them their story. And a lot of sex trafficking data is overly broad or sensationalized. That's very true. Be supportive and share resources. Connect with peer-based sex worker groups and service providers. And then resources. I'm gonna just skip over that part because y'all can come and ask me anything you want, and if there's something specific that you want to know about, I'm more than happy. And I don't know if we have any time at all for a Q&A. A little bit?
Yes, that's what I was hoping we'd save a little time for.
Okay, great.
Okay.
So thank you.
We will. Thank you.
And feel free to ask me anything. I'll answer what I can.
What is the...
I'm Celestina. Somebody just asked my name. Go ahead.
What's the difference between legalization and decriminalization?
Thank you so much for asking. Yay. Okay, so really, I would say in a nutshell, I would say the difference between legalization and decriminalization is about control. So legalization is about like forming an industry and all the laws around it and all the ways that you can control people. Like, for instance, in those counties in Nevada where it is legalized, a person can come into town for the purpose of going into a legal brothel. They have 1 hour to arrive in town, get to the brothel, and they may not leave that brothel. Yeah. That's legal. That's legalization for you. And like once they're done, they have an hour to get from that legal brothel and get out of town. Or they can be arrested. So that's legalization. Decriminalization is like, just leave me the F alone. Like, I can conduct my life however I want. I can create a business where I have employees, I'm paying taxes, I've got, this whole infrastructure, or something just completely casual that's just like, oh, I know this guy that once a month we hook up and he, pays me or takes me out to dinner or, like a wide range of whatever works for people's lives without being criminalized. Does that make sense?
We have one over here for you.
In your talk, the word penetration seemed to be a key word. So can you elaborate a little bit on the definition of penetration?
Well, can you tell me a little bit about what you're getting at?
To me, it seems like penetration is largely a matter of degree. And without, specifying it, I can imagine that in the court, it comes down to lawyers arguing one way and the other.
Yeah, could you just imagine that argument?
But I mean,
just the tip.
Also, I can think that maybe if I touch a woman's clitoris, that might be considered penetration.
Thank you so much for asking. So do you remember the part where I said the person paying? So that's a technicality right there. So the government doesn't think it's sex if you did that. That's not sex according to the government. Even if you're paying. Yeah. So in other words, again, I don't see any children, so I think it's okay for me to say this. I have a friend, I know people, who have made quite a nice living off of getting paid to penetrate gentlemen who like to be penetrated. That's legal. Because the government doesn't consider that sex. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. So, you asked.
So you mentioned that porn is legal, correct? However, are you familiar with, or are you aware of the age verification laws that have been passed in the 5 states now, that make that risky for independent, adult?
Yeah.
performers?
And that brings up the whole question of legalization, because there's all these regulatory things that make it really difficult for people, including condom laws, which when I first started hearing about that, I was like, oh, that sounds good. But the thing of it is people want to be able to make their own decisions about what they're going to do with their body. And the government shouldn't be involved in that. But I'm not entirely sure. You're talking about IDs and... Here, grab the microphone behind you.
So they're verifying it because they don't want children to access porn online.
You're not talking about performers. You're talking about accessing
But
porn.
because of that, there are independent performers who have their own websites.
Right.
That aren't necessarily regulated like big industry sites that are
Yep.
out there. And those people aren't exactly aware of how that's going to affect them, because the marginalized communities do also sell their own content online.
Yeah.
Not just participate in escorting and things like that.
Yeah.
So there's a really thin line of degree of what happens to those performers. And that's kind of what I was getting, if you were aware of that or not.
Yeah. And there's a lot of regulations that make it very difficult, and a lot of legislators use the idea of child exploitation, to essentially make consenting adults' lives a living hell. Unless you're a straight cis white man on a golf course, then by all means.
Celestina, this is we have time for one last question.
Do you know of any local Portland organizations that offer resources for sex workers?
I do know that Portland has a really great bad date list, and I bet you there's contact information on it. So I'm not real connected with sex worker community in Portland, but that might be a really good place to start. Could you hear that?
Inside Out in Portland, Oregon has a clinic for people on the street and for sex workers.
Much for that. Northwest Portland. Okay. Well, it's wonderful that we could be resources for one another. So can we give Celestina Meow a huge, huge gratitude? And then
Thank you all so much. This was really great.
And there's just so much information beyond what I would have ever guessed.
Oh my gosh. Yes, so much more than what we talked about today. In fact, this one right here was well, how far back are you going to go with the history? I'm we could talk about this all day long. I've read some really great books on sex worker history. Caitlin Bailey is a really great resource. Check out her podcast, Old Pros, if y'all get a chance. I love her podcast, and her one woman show is fantastic. It's very, very informative and funny. It's very funny and sexy. She's a stand-up comedian. Caitlin Bailey, check her out.
So with that, one more round of applause. Thank you so much. And we're going to get set for our next speaker. Say that again.